Welcome, everybody, to episode 122, I believe, of Accents on Trial. Today, we're going to be talking about issues of feminism, trans issues, terfs, which we'll get into what that means in a few minutes, and a variety of social issues that we're facing today. My guest today is Suds. I met her on TikTok, and we've had plenty of really good conversations on these topics, and I thought that she would be a very powerful voice in this matter. So I'm going to bring her on right away. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, of course. I really appreciate you having me here, and I'm excited to get to talk about these topics. So.
Perfect. So let's maybe tell the audience a little bit about yourself. What is your background and studies?
Sure. So, well, I'm not going to get too much into like my current professional background, but my educational background is that I have a bachelor's and a master's degree. My master's degree was in a master's of public administration with an emphasis in public policy, and my bachelor's degree was in political science. And in both of those degrees, I studied and engaged a lot with concepts around political ideology, feminism, how public policy comes about in the United States, what like fuels it and drives it, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about these topics.
Sure. So I guess let's get into it. How would you define feminism? What are your views on feminism? How do you think? And then we can also get into what we mean by gender and all the issues that relate to that concept. And I think that in our conversations, it kind of opened up my eyes on some of these things, specifically how this notion of kind of one inherent and exclusive experience of womanhood is ultimately actually a very sexist perspective. And the way that you phrase that for me has been very helpful in sorting these things out. So yeah, let's get into that.
Yeah, so the way that I learned what feminism is through the lens of sort of ideology, right? So feminism is an ideology. It has a meaning that it's a political social concept and set of beliefs that is used to guide a movement or a political agenda. And in the case of feminism, the ultimate kind of goal here is the equality of the sexes. And I think for a lot of feminists, it's also sort of this concept of like liberation for women, liberation for females as well. So yeah, that's kind of the overall of feminism. But feminism, of course, there's multiple waves of feminism. Feminism is a concept that's very, very broad and not easy to kind of summarize.
Yeah, and I guess something that I've run into online, especially more lately, is this idea that trans women are invading women's spaces.
Right.
That if you are if you're supportive of, for example, trans women using women's bathrooms, you're somehow you're supporting endangering women. That if you use the term woman to describe a trans person, that you're like dismissing, in quotes, real womanhood,
right,
and all these talking points that I find to ultimately be not just bigoted towards trans people, but I think inherently actually patriarchal and harming of women, whether trans or not. And
yeah.
I want to hear your perspective.
Well, I agree. I think so. The concept of transgender or just gender studies in general is really, really closely tied to the study of feminism, or, women's studies, as it's usually called in the academy. But I think, there has been a sort of co-opting of late of the moniker of feminism or the label of feminism. That is being used now, unfortunately, to promote a really anti trans, anti gay, anti woman, anti freedom kind of mentality, and it's really unfortunate. From my perspective, um, this is often coming from a group that we would typically label as terfs, which stands for trans exclusionary radical feminists. And just to give a little context on that, radical feminism was the second wave, or it came out of this, what's called the second wave of feminism, which spanned the decades roughly of like the 1960s to the 70s, and some of the 80s too. Where feminists were taking up not just issues of, voting rights and property rights, but they wanted to, liberate women fully and give women autonomy over their bodies. They wanted to challenge the patriarchy, and the word radical, means the root. And so they wanted to kind of bring down patriarchy at the root. I don't believe that transphobia has any place in radical feminism, although radical feminism has for a very long time had strains of transphobia running through it. Even in my own education, meeting with radical feminists who were scholars, in the late 90s and early 2000s, the idea that you should exclude male people or people who are born male from feminism was considered the norm. I think that the third wave of feminism kind of changed all of that. Feminism became intersectional. We began to realize that in order to liberate women, we have to be inclusionary rather than exclusionary. We started to understand the differences between like the social construct of gender and like biological sex. The advent of sort of postmodern feminism, deconstructionist feminism with Judith Butler brought in the ideas of gender performativity, and brought the non-binary and trans experience to the feminist scholarly world. And the interesting thing to me is that this was very much a settled issue in academia, probably beginning around the end of the early 2000s, but it has been revived as sort of a social debate amongst just the hoi polloi, I guess, because there's been this really concerted effort by certain groups to make this issue a wedge issue in Western culture, essentially. But
Can you
yeah,
expand more on that point? This idea of this propaganda being driven by some of those in power.
So, and this doesn't just apply to transphobia. I mean, it's actually very all encompassing. So, from a public policy perspective, right? There are moneyed interests because we have something called Citizens United in this country, which means that money is speech. That's what the Supreme Court determined in that case. And so money speaks, and these moneyed interests have spent billions of dollars over the last, I would say, 2 decades, but primarily within the last decade, right? So from like 2013 to today, to drastically change the conversation around a wide variety of issues, and to advocate for what could be called sort of Christian nationalism in the United States, but they also have a global reach. These organizations, one that I was mentioning earlier is the Alliance Defending Freedom, the ADF. But there are many of these organizations. They're consider themselves think tanks or whatever, but they spend money and resources to push and promote anti-LGBT legislation, anti-woman legislation. They were the backers behind having women's abortion rights, taken away, putting, prayer in school, making this country and many other countries in the West, stamp them with kind of Christianity and nationalism. They have been, instrumental in also Africa, the Middle East. So, I mean, this is a kind of a global issue. Russia, the way that politics works in 2023, in terms of, this idea that we used to have of like the grassroots. A lot of what goes on now that you would see maybe in like a school board meeting or people talking on TikTok, a lot of that's been influenced from the top down. It's because so much money has been being spent, so much lobbying is taking place, so much money is being spent, especially in social media spaces, to kind of promote these ideas, transphobia, anti-feminism, religious sort of supremacy, and those kind of things. And that's something that I think a lot of people on the left know kind of inherently, but maybe they don't have like the right words to necessarily define the fact that these organizations have essentially unified for this purpose. This is not, it's not a debate about feminism. It is a Christian conservative movement that has hijacked the name of feminism and has convinced a lot of sort of people who may have considered themselves feminists that this is a feminism discussion, that this is a debate within feminism, where it really isn't.
I think that in my conversations with people on the conservative side, like when we talk about, well, what is a woman or what is a man, I'm often met with this, I feel like, very intellectually dishonest narrative where they're not even really engaging in the conversation.
Yeah.
They have a script, and regardless of what you say, they're going to repeat the same script, even if it doesn't actually address your points. And so, and of course, if it's me talking about these things, looking the way that I look, they can just say, oh, well, you're a man, of course you're going to view things this way. And I always say to them, well, I know plenty of biological women that agree with me. In fact, my views have been shaped by them. And then at that point, you're like, oh, well, they're just confused. Like, actually address the conversation, actually address the points. I don't care about how you personally feel about it. I care about what you can actually defend and provide evidence for. So one thing that I think we're in agreement on is that attempting to define womanhood by simply pointing to a number of biological functions is completely detrimental to women.
Absolutely.
I don't. Yeah, go ahead.
I think, and that's something that you know, a wide variety of feminists, I think, used to agree on. I think especially radical feminists used to have very were strongly in opposition of the idea of reducing women to biological functions only, especially because that was the era. Those were the feminists who, brought about a Roe v. Wade. Those were the feminists who tried to fight for the ERA. And, I think that it's sad. I mean, I think that there's also kind of a demographic and kind of historical story going on here where you see a lot of like cis women, boomers, and maybe Gen Xers who, were parts of, the movement to kind of liberate women from the, I would say, like confines of just being a body, just being a body that gets pregnant, just being a mother, only having these certain prescribed roles. And I think that those same women, unfortunately, have bought into this idea that, oh, wait, actually, no, those are the things that make you a woman. When, we had kind of already had that discussion and realized that it was sexism that had given us that idea.
But that's the thing too. Like when I talk with these people and I say, okay, so you're saying that a woman is an adult human female, and trans women aren't women because they can't get pregnant, they don't have periods. Like, okay, well, let's follow that line of logic. If a woman chooses to not have kids, have they ceased to have an experience of womanhood?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I think that that's such an important point in all of these discussions because the organized opposition, so to speak, wants not just to erase trans people, but they do want to turn women into baby factories. They have very specific reasons for needing to do that. That's why they've made abortion a crime in much of the country, because they are nationalists who want a growing population. And I think women and feminists used to understand this, because there was a time when I think, especially like for our grandmothers, that women, died regularly in childbirth. They experienced horrific, patriarchal violence. They did not have control over their reproductive life, and they didn't have control over their financial life. They were essentially owned by men. And, I think the further we kind of got away from that reality, a lot of women, a lot of feminists, and I think specifically women and feminists who are not intersectional, who did not kind of join the third wave and like understand that, oh, wow, like feminism isn't just about white women. It's not just about cis women. It's not just about straight women. Like it's about, so many more people. And I think that's kind of the problem, is that those particular individuals decided, well, this was good enough for me, but I don't want anybody else to have those freedoms, and that's why we've lost them.
I think that's something that I find enraging is, the hypocrisy of people who know what it's like to be a targeted group to then go and do that to the next person, right?
Right.
I mean, a few weeks ago, maybe months ago, I was on a TikTok live where this trans woman was saying, gender fluid or non-binary people are confused. They should pick a side. they're the ones that are like predatory. Like you basically using a lot of the talking points that were used against them as trans people, like about correctness of language, for example,
Right.
and just like the cognitive dissonance of people like that, I find repulsive even more than um, those that are already in power, because at least, I mean, that's still disgusting as well, obviously, but at least you can blame to some degree, oh well, they're coming from a place of privilege, they don't understand or can't empathize with what it's like to be targeted. Not that justifies it, it's still something that needs to be fought and criticized, but at least I can understand that how somebody can arrive at those conclusions, um, even if those conclusions are completely incorrect. When somebody knows what it's like to be targeted and then so easily goes and does it to the next person, the next group, the next, identity, I find it so hypocritical.
It is hypocritical. It's also a part of human nature, unfortunately. And I think it's a part of human nature that is worth being studied and being talked about and being really well understood, especially by scholars and academics and people who want to understand what's going on right now, in sort of a historical context. I mean, I studied uh, a lot of political philosophy that had to do with sort of where fascist movements come from, and like how do quote unquote good people or sort of ordinary people or even liberal people become, Nazis. Like how does that happen? Hannah Arendt is a philosopher that I would strongly recommend for all the viewers to check out. She wrote on the origins of totalitarianism. She wrote on violence. She also wrote. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name of the book. I think it was Eichmann in Jerusalem. Yeah, that's it. And she coined the term the banality of evil, right? So what she witnessed when she went to the Nuremberg trials after World War II, and Hannah Arendt, just so everybody knows, was a Jewish woman, a Jewish philosopher who escaped Germany and survived the war, but was a victim of the Holocaust and lost family members and friends, and escaped to the United States, and had a very keen understanding of what had gone on in that situation. And when she went to Nuremberg, basically was able to understand right away that uh, this is not a problem with just the Nazis. This is a human nature problem, because what she witnessed was that many of sort of the Jewish authorities in Israel sort of becoming equally rigid, equally fascistic, and kind of once liberated from their own horrific experiences, their children and many others, could easily, and she asked this question, how could someone easily fall into that mindset? Wouldn't you be doing everything in your power to be sort of anti-fascism? And the thing is that when someone has gone through trauma, if they've been oppressed, there's a certain kind of psychological benefit that they get from oppressing and harming someone who's weaker than them, and it gives them a little bit of a feeling of like, a boost, essentially. And that's the only thing that I can kind of say. I mean, I also think that a lot of the people who are joining the, anti-trans movement have been, fed a lot of propaganda, and very constructed, news media, about the trans threat, this horrible threat of trans people coming to take over their spaces and take over their lives, when trans people represent such a tiny portion of our overall population. They are far more likely to be the victims of violence, of gender-based violence, than the rest of the population, that they face it, astronomically higher suicide rates, all of this. But this is the standard method that fascists use to essentially scapegoat a group, dehumanize that group, turn that group into the cause of all the problems in the society. And right now, it seems that trans people have become that group.
Yeah. Well, so let's get into the issue of trans people in or trans people in bathrooms, and and trans women in women's sports. One thing that I've often had thrown at me, an accusation that I've had thrown at me, is that if I'm okay with males in women's spaces, then I'm okay with endangering women.
Right.
And I find that to be so misguided. But I would like to hear your thoughts about. Let's start with bathrooms first, and then go
Bathrooms.
into.
Okay, so I think the thing about the bathroom debate, right? So this is sort of the oldest of the trans debates, especially when it comes to like public policy. This was one of the areas where we first started to see a lot of people on the right, the Republicans, deciding that they wanted to pass laws to ban trans people, right? Because apparently this had become uh, an epidemic of trans women in particular, coming into the women's restroom and physically harming cisgendered women in the bathroom. Now, of course, just as in any situation, there are always going to be cases where, some sort of an exception that proves the rule, right? And there have been cases where someone identifying as a trans woman or someone who's actually a trans woman has committed a crime against a cis woman in a public restroom. But is this the scourge that it is, kind of claimed to be? Is this the epidemic? Of course not. The vast majority of trans people who feel comfortable enough to go into a public bathroom in the first place, which I can imagine is a very fraught experience if you're trans, are going to go in there, use the bathroom, wash their hands, and leave, just like the rest of us. The other thing too is also this idea of women's vulnerability in public spaces, and are we safe, when we're out there in the world. And I think that it's unfortunate that that this idea of women's safety is getting co-opted by sort of terfism and anti-trans, because there had been a really great conversation going on in feminist circles, at least for a long time, of the idea of rape culture and what that means, and why women should speak up and have good conversations about what drives sexual assault. And it's not trans people that are driving the absolute epidemic of sexual assault that both cis and trans women experience, and will experience statistically in their life. That is caused, of course, by patriarchy. It's caused by rape culture. It's caused by systems that are in place that make it very difficult for women to come forward when they've been assaulted, and so on. But my stance on the bathroom issue is, unless we start putting locks on the bathrooms, at this point, anybody who wants to do harm can come in the bathroom and do harm. And I think most trans people, that's not the case. They just want to use the bathroom like everybody else. And so I don't have a problem with that.
But that's the thing
Yeah.
that's, to me, is so simple, right? Like, have there be, set up a situation where when you do have public bathrooms, maybe you have security guards nearby, in context where, like, if you're in a large concert or something, and it's hard to keep that situation safe. Well, that's just a danger of living in the world, right? And so, if somebody is evil enough to want to go into a bathroom and hurt somebody else, they're going to do it. It's not like now they're going to pretend to be trans or dress as a woman,
Right.
to then get their chance, right? Like,
exactly. And by the way, there is no magical force field at the door of a women's restroom that keeps people who are born male out. There's no, I mean, men can already go into women's restrooms and assault women, and they do.
Right.
And actually, the real big threat to women in the restroom is cis men coming into the bathroom. We know that. The people who want to blame or who want to demonize trans people are the same people who think that men inherently protect women and will come to their aid and their rescue. And so maybe in that case, we should have cis men standing outside the women's restroom and protecting the cis women inside. I don't know.
I would also say to that, though, that's part of the people that support that, but I think it's also those that just view all men as threats.
Right.
And so, yeah, there are those that view men as the protector. There are also those that just view men as aggressors, and regardless of who you are, the kind of the misandrist perspective, right? Which is just, if you're born a male, you are a danger. And it's one thing to say, from the perspective of a woman, you're going to be more careful around men because, generally speaking, the statistics are what they are. That's completely understandable. But to then, project that onto trans women and say, oh, just because you're born male, now you are a danger to me in this bathroom, I think is just misplaced. It has a lot more to do with culture than it has to do with biology.
Yeah. Well, it also, belies a deep misunderstanding of sexual assault and why sexual assault happens and what the psychology is of people who sexually assault others and why they do it. I had a conversation earlier with someone who felt that, someone who'd had a trans woman who'd had bottom surgery couldn't rape anyone and therefore should be allowed to go in the women's room. That it's just a silly understanding of what sexual assault actually is. It's not, a penis in and of itself is not all, and it is not the only thing that is needed in order to harm someone sexually. And it's also not the reason that, overwhelmingly cis men are the perpetrators of sexual violence. It's not because they have penises. It's because we live in a patriarchal society. And we live in a society where, in order to exert patriarchal power, and also just for generally reasons of wanting to exert power, it drives, the vast majority of sexual assault. And so anybody can be sexually assaulted by anybody, whether they have a penis or not, whether they are cis or trans or male or female. We know statistically who is more likely to commit that, but that all falls down really to the culture that kind of promotes the idea of men and women in that way, that men are these, can't control their urges and, have to exert control over the women that they see or are in their lives. That all comes from patriarchy.
So what would you say about women's sports? Because that's another
Yeah.
point. That's another talking point that I think is very misguided. It's just kind of this false concern for women's rights that's actually driven by far more.
Yeah, absolutely. If I would challenge any TERF or anti-trans quote unquote feminist. Let's actually have a conversation about women's sports and the inequality in women's sports, because where the real inequality lies is in the pay scale. And then you'll hear the chorus from those same individuals being like, well, women's sports aren't popular, nobody wants to watch a bunch of women playing games or whatever. And that is why I think this issue is so fabricated. It's so kind of constructed. Of course, there are, and by the way, I wanted to point this out. The issue of trans women in women's sports, the issue of trans women going to bathrooms, the issue of banning gender affirming care for minors, all of these things are legislative agendas, right? So that's not just debates that people are having. These are specific goals, legislative goals, that certain groups have. And in order to get their laws and bills passed, they utilize a wide network of propaganda to essentially create a narrative that makes it seem like these things are an epidemic. Oh, trans women in women's sports is destroying women's sports, right? Like that's what you hear from that side of things. And, the closer you look, the more you can tell how constructed that is, because one organization in particular, the Alliance Defending Freedom, I read a whole host of articles, right, about situations where, a trans woman had taken the victory out of the hands of a cis woman in a sports competition. And in all of those situations, the cis woman was suing the body that allowed that to happen, whether that was the school or the sports organization that had allowed it to happen. And guess who their lawyers were? It was the Alliance Defending Freedom. And so all of these news articles, right, that go out in traditionally conservative publications, they're on Fox News, they're on the New York Post, they're on Newsmax, they're on Breitbart, they're all over the place, right? These stories are all also created and written and constructed by the PR, branch of the ADEF, and they're perfect because they can flood the news cycle with these stories and make it look like it's a gigantic problem when the numbers don't really bear that out. The other thing too that you'll notice if you really dive deep is that in those situations where these cis women are suing, what you read in their argument, really very little information about the individual who beat them, but much more information about how it made the cis woman feel. The cis woman felt really bad because the trans woman won the competition, but we don't know information about, for example, if that trans woman had definite measurable biological advantages, which that part of the conversation seems to go out the window, because what people do is they say, well, if you're born male, you just have an advantage.
A
Well,
couple, yeah,
yeah,
a couple of things. I
that's
want to read his comments because I thought it was funny. Titan writes, I dislike the term terf, called them feminism appropriating radical transphobes, which would add up to fart. The acronym is funnier and they hate it. I think that's amazing.
that's perfect, actually, because it is an appropriation of feminism. It is not feminism. You know, these, and I want to say this because I think this is, part of the conversation. Feminism had a big crisis, in the 90s and early 2000s around these issues, and kind of came through it, like I mean in like a scholarly sense. There was a lot of rejection of like Butler's ideas when she first became more mainstream, and those things got worked out in those spheres by actual, if we're going to, like, let's be real, like those things were worked out in the academy in terms of what philosophically and on a scholarly level we mean by woman, we mean by gender, we mean, all this stuff got worked out, and had been for a long time. These individuals, the terfs, these people claiming to be feminists, are, I guess what you would call them is, I think they're disgruntled women who are almost certainly, in most cases, middle class. I think that they are part of a growing group of people who have been ignored by our, machine-like society, pushed aside, pushed around, certainly harmed by patriarchy, probably harmed by men. They may be sexual assault survivors, right? It is very easy to manipulate a group of people into fighting amongst themselves rather than turning their power and their ire towards the truly powerful in society. It's very easy to get people to pick on others, especially, trans people are so, like, they're such a small minority of the population. It's not like the way it was with gay people, where, pretty much everyone knows a gay friend, or, a lot of, there's a lot fewer trans people, right? So it's very easy, because they're mysterious, to kind of come up with this boogeyman idea about who and what a trans person is.
Well, I want to say something about the trans sports issue, because the reality is that we don't see what they're claiming reflected in the numbers. If every time a trans person went into the sports and started dominating, then you would have a point, right? These people would have a point to some degree. But that's not what we're seeing. Like, I mean, somebody that, terfs always want to complain about is Leah Thomas.
Yeah.
But they were ignoring the fact that Leah Thomas has been beaten, for the most part, has been beaten by cis women.
Right.
So it's like when she gets beaten, nobody wants to say anything. But
exactly.
But when she wins, it's because they're trans. Either
that's totally correct. It reminds me of the reason why affirmative action ultimately fell, was because a lot of white people, sort of ordinary, middle of the, we might say mediocre white students, believed that if a person of color succeeded over them, it was because they'd gotten a special advantage, and not just because they beat them. Well, and that's the other thing too that we're not acknowledging, is the fact that some women beat some other women at sports competitions.
But that's always the case in any sport. Like, right? There's always going to be, everybody can train as hard as they can, but ultimately there are going to be biological advances, men versus men and women versus women. There's just going to be those advantages. Now, the idea is, if someone born a male who goes through these treatments that are aimed to undo those potential advantages, goes through those treatments, like for example, treatments that um, remove issues with like muscle mass and
Yeah.
bone density and things of that nature, um, then where is the problem? Because if there was no treatment that could resolve those supposed inherent advantages, then you would never see a trans woman lose in the sport. They would always win because there would be no way of overcoming this advantage. But that's not what we're seeing.
Right.
And so it when they say, "Oh well," I mean, is a trans person never supposed to win? Then they're always supposed to lose at every competition because they were born a certain kind of way. No, it's like you unless you can show that them winning actually had to do with the fact that they were born male, as opposed to that on that day they were just better than their competition. They don't have a leg to stand on. We're not
I
seeing this
completely.
epidemic of trans people overtaking sports. This is just delusional.
And this is why I say it goes back to feelings, right? Because ultimately, what's being kind of the information that's being put out there in the news media is really about the feelings of these cis women who didn't win their competition. And look, anybody who doesn't win their competition is going to have some rough feelings. But if you feel like, oh, well, that person got a special advantage, you're going to have some pretty hard feelings about it. And I think that by promoting that narrative, you know, it turns the whole issue into a wedge issue that now conservatives can rally behind and go, this isn't right. Just like, so in Mississippi, they just passed a ban on trans women in sports, right? I think they called it the bill for women's fairness in Mississippi. It was signed by Tate Reeves, who is without a doubt one of the most misogynistic pigs in this country. Tate Reeves, disgusting human being. But they can claim the moniker of that they're fighting for fairness for women. It's really just about it comes down to just feelings, really,
Uh,
not facts.
Bones also makes a good point. We could make sports unisex, then it would be no longer an issue. I think that would be interesting.
That would be interesting. I think obviously there are clear biological differences between men and women, males and females. And I'm not even for 100% of like all self-ID'd, trans women competing with cis women. I do think there needs to be some science in it. I think that,
Yeah,
there
absolutely.
needs to be,
They have to
clear.
go through a
Yeah.
type through treatment that
Yeah.
would, yeah, but that's already how it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
We don't have just people saying, oh, without the treatment you can't just step into the other sport. um
Yeah.
but what was I gonna say? I was gonna say something, I can't remember what it was. Yeah, is there anything else that you want to add that you think that our audience
Yeah.
should
Just
hear
that,
about?
I think it's important to remember that trans people are a group that have always been demonized by fascist movements. They were a part of uh, the large groups of people who were executed in the Holocaust by the Nazis. I think they were the first group actually to begin to be executed were trans people in Nazi Germany. Um, that the project of gender roles of man and woman is a really important project for fascists because they need men to be soldiers to fight wars, and they need women to be mothers to have babies to make more soldiers. And uh, I just would really love it if more people would wake up to that reality, that that is why these issues are getting pushed down America's throat. And that's also the reason why while these women are sitting here blaming trans women and demonizing trans women, their rights are being stripped from them. You know, we lost a major right when Roe was overturned. That was something that I think is the greatest blow to feminism that we've seen in my lifetime. And to ignore that and focus instead on trans people is, you know, a clear example that a lot of people have been propagandized. So that's
Yeah,
kind of my focus.
absolutely. Um, Tatiana, I did get your friend request. I just accepted it. So yeah, definitely send me that link. I'll definitely check that out. But no, one thing I've also noticed is that uh, again, a lot of people that are against human, the trans people having the same basic rights are people that can't even engage in a conversation on any sensible level. Like, I had a debate um, a couple weeks ago with someone on TikTok. They can't even get past the first step, which is to say, yes, we are making a distinction between sex and gender. No trans person is pretending or claiming that they were a different sex than they were born with. What we're saying is that there is more to our identity than just our sex. There's a psychosocial aspect to what we are. That gender is more than biology. That gender, then there is sex, then there is gender, then there is gender expression,
Right.
and there is no confusion if we explain what it is that we mean by the terms. In language we can use the same sounds to mean different concepts, right? And
Yes.
as long as I say, okay, I'm using the term woman here in the context of gender, so in this context, talking about psychosocial phenomena, not one's biology, then there should be no confusion. But someone like that I was engaging with has to remain dishonest and has to
Right.
pretend that there is an ambiguity there that cannot be resolved, because ultimately what they're trying to push is forcing people into these gender roles that he wants to say are actually ultimately inherent, um, and so it's serving a larger narrative and dogma that they're trying to push across.
Yes.
If any cis person can recognize what it's like to identify with your body and identify with your sex, then there shouldn't be any kind of conceptual confusion with the idea of, hey, there are people that have an incongruence with that body they were born with that
Yeah.
sex they were born with. And all we're saying is, because people want to say, oh, well, trans people, the irony of saying facts don't care about your feelings and then them wanting to reject all the facts that show why trans people are valid because of their feelings,
Of
usually
course.
being driven by religious ideology.
Exactly. I don't
Um,
think you can downplay the importance of Christian nationalism in this conversation, because you know it it is really where all of this is coming from. And you know, people like to not talk about that during these conversations, but the trans hate is coming from the church. It's coming from uh, but an alliance, let's say, between global Christian powers and global Islamic powers. Because in addition to, you know, powerful entities like the Vatican and you know, Russian global media and things like that. We have also places like Saudi Arabia and Iran who are big players in terms of spreading anti-gay and anti-trans propaganda globally through a wide array of channels. And so you might say that this is a kind of a patriarchal religion alliance to push very narrow and constricted gender roles on all people, all over.
Yeah, and it's especially draining when people, even within the community, have been kind of brainwashed into, thinking that a binary is all there is, and then wanting to, like, putting the blame on the wrong person. Like, so I spoke with another trans woman that was frustrated at the existence of how would I say this? They took issue with the idea that non-binary people should be viewed under the trans umbrella, when they absolutely can be viewed under the umbrella, because non-binary people have an incongruence with the sex they were born with. It doesn't have to fit a binary. And they were complaining that they, as a trans woman, are getting all this new hate they hadn't experienced before because people are outraged at non-binary people.
Right.
But to me, it's like,
right.
Okay, let's say that that's true. You're gonna aim your anger at non-binary people as opposed to the bigots that are reacting in that way, who reacted badly to you in the first place anyway. Like, it's misplaced anger.
Absolutely. Misplaced anger. I think misplaced anger is sort of ruling the day right now. I'm not sure, but I have this theory that COVID kind of did something psychologically to a lot of people. And in the sense of like it caused a lot of people to kind of feel this deep sense that they were getting screwed over by the system. But it is extremely hard for people to go against the system, even when they know that it's wrong. It's much easier to blame a scapegoat. It's much easier to kind of be divided up into categories rather than coming together and forming coalitions. It's much easier to have these internecine, conflicts, civil wars, than it is to just open your eyes and recognize that a handful of people own the rest of us and are making the choices that are leading to suffering for a lot of people on this planet. And by turning our ire towards gay people, trans people, people who are different from us, just anybody who's different from you, they keep the upper hand and we lose. So I think that's just another really important principle that people should be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. We're hitting the 1 hour mark. Is there anything else you want to add before we? Is that all? Okay.
That's all.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I think this was,
it was
really
fun.
good.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, anytime. And thank you everybody for sticking, with us and supporting the channel. I know for a while we weren't really posting much, but I'm aiming to get back on track and come back with more regular content. I think that I'm going to be posting a video of a previous TikTok conversation where my brother and I, if you're familiar with my channel, you know that my brother is a physicist and a science educator. We engaged with this Christian who has a large following on TikTok, but who is constantly misspreading information or spreading misinformation to a painful degree. And I thought that conversation was a thing of beauty. I mean, my brother completely, exposed the guy's ignorance, and I've been wanting to post that video up here for a while, so I think that's going to be coming in the next couple of days. So watch out for that. And yeah, I hope everybody has a great rest of your weekend, and I will see you guys again soon. So I hope, take care, and I'll see you soon.